begin in verse 1. A quick summary of what we've covered thus far. Daniel 1 introduces us to Daniel and his three friends, uprooted from their home in Judah and resettled and re-educated in Babylon sometime around the age of 14 or 15. This occurred 606/605 BC. Daniel 2, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, an image of gold, silver, bronze, and iron and clay. He can't remember his dream, but he knows he's had one. He summons his advisors, demand that they not only tell him what he dreamed, but then, of course, what the dream meant. They were unable to do that. Daniel finally comes on the scene, reminds Nebuchadnezzar that this is a request that no human can actually honor. But there is a God who knows the dreams that people have and what they mean. And he reveals to Daniel the dream and its meaning. In chapter 3, one of the best-known stories in the Old Testament, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are thrown in the fiery furnace, but they come out without a single hair singe, not even smelling of smoke. And while in the furnace, a fourth person was seen walking around unharmed, probably an angel of God dispatched to deliver the three young men from the effects of that fiery furnace. We concluded chapter 4 last week, another dream from Nebuchadnezzar. This time it's of a great tree. He remembers his dream, but when he summons his advisors, they cannot, for the life of them, tell him what his dream really was about. Perhaps because they knew that it did not bode well for the king and they did not want to be bearers of bad news. Daniel steps up to the stage and again tells the king the meaning of the dream, which is ultimately fulfilled. And at its fulfillment, Nebuchadnezzar realizes that there is indeed a God who is above all gods, the God that Daniel worshiped and served. And now in chapter 5, we have gone through the period of the Babylonian Empire from about 606 BC to now 539/538 BC. Nebuchadnezzar is out of the picture now, and the man who is described as king of Babylon in chapter 5 is identified as Belshazzar. The first problem that I will tell you about is that in the Babylonian Chronicles and in other ancient historical documents, there for a long time was no reference to Belshazzar at all. We now know that he was in fact connected to King Nabonidus, either by adoption or by birth, and that Nabonidus left Babylon, spent a period of 10 years or so away from the capital, and left Belshazzar in charge. For all practical purposes, he was the ruling king, and thus he is referred to as King Belshazzar. The word king in the Aramaic language, and Aramaic is very similar to Hebrew, is melech, and it can also be translated governor, and there's at least one tablet that archaeologists have uncovered where the word is used interchangeably, governor or king. What we know for a fact is that this man was ruling Babylon when the events that are chronicled in chapter 5 actually unfold. This is the fall of the Babylonian kingdom. The prophets had predicted that there would be a 70-year Babylonian captivity for the inhabitants of Judea. If that time frame begins in about 606 BC, it actually concludes in 536 BC, about 3 years or so after the events of chapter 5, when Cyrus, who had been designated as the ultimate freer of Israel from bondage, made a decree that Israel could return from Babylonian captivity back home to Judea and in Jerusalem in particular. But before that happened, the Babylonian Empire had to end and the Medo-Persian Empire had to begin. And when you looked at chapter 2 and the figure that Daniel interpreted for the king, the head of gold represented the Babylonian kingdom, and the arms and breast of silver represented the Medo-Persian Empire. We're now at that stage where the Medo-Persian Empire comes to the forefront and the Babylonian Empire ceases to be. I'm going to begin simply verse by verse tonight rather than read the entire text and then return to it, because my hope is that you have all read Daniel 5 in preparation for tonight's study, and as a result you're very familiar with the overall story. So we can just begin and go verse by verse and make the kinds of comments that I hope will bring the text alive and give you a really better appreciation for it. King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Herodotus and Xenophon, both ancient historians, say that when the events of chapter 5 unfold, it was at a time of year in Babylon where there was an annual festival in which a great deal of drinking occurred. And it involved nearly everyone in Babylon, from the king all the way down to the lowliest of the citizens. And I'm using Babylon right now for the capital city. Babylon is a designation for the city that's located a few miles north of modern Baghdad, but it also is the same term that's used for the entire empire. We're talking about the city tonight, the festival that's underway, and it's really interesting at the very time that this king and 1,000 of his lords have come together to celebrate this festival. Babylonian army has, for all practical purposes, out in the field been defeated. And now it is surrounding the city of Babylon. But while the army surrounds the city and begins to do its preparations for an extensive siege, the king and the leadership are partying. There is actually historical record again from Herodotus and Xenophon that noted that Babylon was really unconcerned about the approaching army and the siege of their city because, as I mentioned last week, they were surrounded by a double wall, a 17-mile-long wall with a moat between. They had a large man-made lake in the city, and further, the Euphrates River ran through the middle of the city, under the walls, coming in at the north and exiting at the south. With a 20-year supply of food, impregnable walls, they really felt that they were secure. But what they didn't expect, and I think I mentioned this to you last week, was that Cyrus and his army would divert the waters of the Euphrates. They would actually dig a canal, divert the waters away from the wall, and would thus be able to enter through the riverbed into the city, which was unguarded because no one was expecting it. And they were able to take the city that night almost without a fight, And that very night that is being described here in chapter 5, Belshazzar was slain by two of Cyrus's generals. So that's the basic background and setting for what is unfolding here. I can't imagine a party of 1,000 guests. I can't imagine the cost of such a party and everything that that would entail. But this is government, and government never concerns itself with cost. It is a little thing to bring these representatives together and celebrate this great festival. And of course, in a worldly sense, one of the things that is almost always associated with these kinds of parties is alcohol. And alcohol, as you know, except in very small quantities, has no real positive contributions to make to society. I said except in really small quantities because I am aware of what Paul told Timothy, take a little wine for your stomach's sake. I think everything in this world has a purpose. And the problems that we face in life, often with things that create problems, is that we tend to overindulge, to misuse what God has created, and in the end product, much damage and no good comes. Alcohol can, in very small quantities, in medicinal uses, be beneficial. That doesn't justify social drinking. It doesn't justify the indiscriminate use of alcohol, because when those kinds of things occur, these kinds of things occur. And if you want to avoid them, one of the steps you take is to avoid the kinds of things that lead to difficulty. So here we are in Babylon. The king and 1,000 of his advisors, political associates, are celebrating a festival. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. I will tell you immediately that Belshazzar's literal father was not Nebuchadnezzar, and that he does not follow Nebuchadnezzar as the ruler of Babylon. In fact, when Nebuchadnezzar died, he was succeeded to the throne by his son, Evil-Merodach, who reigned from 562 to 560 BC. And then there are a series of 3 other lesser kings, ultimately leading up to Belshazzar, who is the last king, and the one that Cyrus defeats to end the Babylonian kingdom and begin the Medo-Persian Empire. The idea that Nebuchadnezzar is his father is probably to be understood in the sense that in the lineage of the kings of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar came first, Belshazzar came later. We have thus descendants and ancestry more than anything else involved, and not something to be taken in the way we generally associate fathers and sons. And if you look at Scripture carefully, you'll find that this kind of use is very common in the Bible and in secular ancient literature, that if you're in the lineage of someone, it's appropriate that you refer to him as father. No one would even bat an eye at that. That's why the Jews, even in John 8, say we have but one father, Abraham. Not one of them was literally the son of Abraham in the sense in which we know the word father and son to be interconnected today. But in the sense of being descendants, they were all descendants of Abraham. And I think that's all that we're dealing with here. And I only point it out to you because if you do extensive reading and really try to comprehend the nature of Daniel, you're going to find people who question Daniel's authorship, who deny the historicity of the text, who reject the authorship of the 6th century and want to relegate it to the 2nd century BC, and are looking everywhere they can for reasons to reject the text, and this is one of them. Belshazzar wasn't literally Nebuchadnezzar's son. Well, that's not what is even meant. He is a descendant and the rightful ruler. He is second in command because we know historically that Nabonidus, who was in fact the king and probably the adopted father, because there seems to be some indication that Belshazzar had been adopted into the family because Nabonidus had no male offspring to succeed him, that he was off actually rebuilding temples that had been destroyed in honor of his gods, and left Belshazzar at home to see to state affairs. So here he is in charge in Babylon, and at this party he does something that would typically be unthinkable. He takes what are clearly sacred objects and uses them in a profane way. When Nebuchadnezzar removed these sacred vessels from the temple in Jerusalem, he put them in the temple of his God. We know that historically. That was out of respect for the God of the Jews. What Belshazzar does is an act of total disrespect. And he, as I said, takes sacred things and profanes them. And he uses these sacred vessels as drinking vessels for his wives. I mentioned at the outset, one of the things about Nebuchadnezzar that seems to have stood out as we began our study is that unlike a lot of kings who saw their rule as an opportunity just to enhance their own personal position and acquire additional wives and concubines, Nebuchadnezzar really did seem to be vitally interested in his kingdom and in his capital and in ruling as well as he could rule given his background and his understanding as an idolater. Belshazzar, on the other hand, seems to be more typical of kings, and he's focused on things and wives and concubines and all of that sensual stuff that tends to come into the lives of people who have more power and more wealth than they can wisely utilize. So he's got his wives, and we don't know how many, and his concubines, and again, we don't know how many, drinking out of sacred vessels and profaning what should have been held aloft as precious. How would God respond to such action? That's what chapter 5 is all about. It may be that God witnesses this and even hastens what he knew would occur, the fall of Babylon and the rise of the Medes and the Persians. And by the way, don't think that this is something that just the pagan kings, idolaters, did. How many wives did Solomon have? And how many concubines? 300 and 700. What about David? David, he's not like his son Solomon. He had only 8 wives. There's no reference to the number of concubines he had. This, sadly, was typical of men in positions of power and wealth, not just Belshazzar, but a whole host. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem. And the kings and his lords, his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Interestingly, we've already encountered in that order gold, silver, bronze, and iron, haven't we? And iron mixed with clay. Wood and stone are new to the record of Daniel, but the first four made up the image that Daniel interpreted regarding Nebuchadnezzar's first dream. These are pagan deities, and if you read Isaiah and Jeremiah and pay careful attention to what those two prophets have to say about idolatry, I think it's really insightful, because they reminded Israel over and over and over again that their God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, was real, and he was powerful. He could speak. He could move. He could act. But the gods of their neighbors could do nothing. They could not speak. They had no locomotion. They had to be carried from place to place. They were made by man out of the very materials that are described here. And in Isaiah's account, Isaiah uses the analogy of a man going out and cutting down a tree. And with a third of the tree, he heats his home. With a third, he cooks his meals. And with the third, he carves a god and falls down before it and worships it. Same tree. Now, you've got to admit, if you're a thinking person, that makes no sense. But that is really the history of human civilization. I'd like to tell you that things have changed a lot since those days, but I don't believe that's the case. I think the images of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone are different than those that we encounter in Scripture. Today, they may come in the form of a driver, a 3-iron, or a 3-wood, a set of irons, and a bunch of golf balls. Because there are all kinds of people out here in the world who think that Sundays are just golf. They may come in the form of a fiberglass boat and an Evinrude motor and a day on the river. That's their God. Or it might be a NASCAR race where you just sit in your chair and watch cars go around over and over and over and over again. Can't miss that. Yeah, you can, because you close your eyes and wake up an hour later, they're still going around the same circle. You haven't missed a thing. But you can't miss it. I just cite 3 examples. I could go on and on and on where we've crowded God out and we've substituted these kinds of things. Why are we any different than the pagans of Babylon or the Medo-Persians or the Greeks? I think the answer from God would be, you're really not. But this is what happened. Profaning sacred things. Immediately, the fingers of a human hand appeared. Can you just for a moment envision this? A white wall. You can look to your right or to your left. There's a large white wall. The palace of Belshazzar has actually been uncovered. Archaeologists discovered that it was rather immense, that it was covered with ceramic tile, blue, and white plaster. And the very tile that were used, some of them have been recovered, and sections of the plaster were available. This book is so accurate that it could not have been written unless the one who wrote actually experienced the things that they record, or as we would say today, are guided by God's Spirit. That's what inspiration is all about. So just imagine you're staring at this plastered white wall, and all of a sudden a hand appears. What is that all about? Well, did you know that in ancient days, to count the dead, they often just lopped off their hand? And rather than present the whole body to demonstrate the number of casualties, it's easier to discard the body and just bring the hand. And it may be that because this was very common with the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and perhaps even to a lesser degree, the Persians, that he got the picture pretty quickly. This is about death. But whose death? It's about the end, but whose end? He sees this hand, it appears, and it writes on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. That got my attention. It was opposite the lampstand. I can't tell you any more about the lampstand because there obviously are no photographs, no vivid descriptions, but it must have been something special that Daniel would note it as he does here. The king saw the hand as it wrote. Probably the reference to the lampstand is to give us some indication of how the king could easily see what was unfolding. We would say the light was shining on it. He could see the hand, and he could see that the hand was writing. Then the king's color changed. We'd probably say he became as white as a ghost. The blood went out of his face. His thoughts alarmed him. Oh, what's going on here? This does not bode well for me. And his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. I think I was telling you last week about being the bearer of bad news, which I have, in my line of work, done more than I would ever want to do. And I've seen people who react to bad news just like the king did. I had to tell someone their son had died in a motorcycle accident, and the blood just went out of their face and they just fell to the floor. They're not a good way to really bear bad news, and this is the pretty typical way of dealing with it when it comes. So this is what's going on. Nebuchadnezzar's son, his descendant, is in Babylon, the final ruler, about to meet his maker and discover who God really is when he sees this hand and what it writes on the wall. The king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. These are the same group of people that Nebuchadnezzar had relied on in chapter 2 and chapter 4. Not the same in the sense that they're identical people. They are the same in the sense that they have the same office, because we're looking at a real distance in years between the events of chapter 4 and chapter 5, because Nebuchadnezzar recovered and returned to his place on the throne and continued to reign a while longer. So we're talking about a considerable period of time between the events in chapter 2 and the events in chapter 5. But it's the same office. And probably many of these who are now the advisors of the king, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers, are the sons and grandsons of those who had attempted to advise Nebuchadnezzar. These kinds of things tend to stay in the family, like the priesthood in Judaism stayed within the Levitical tribe, and the high priesthood within the family of Aaron. If they follow the law, every high priest will have a direct line back to Aaron. So we would expect that these are men who have come into these positions because their fathers and grandfathers before them had served the king in this capacity. The king declared to the wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." Now, when you read what is offered, interpret the handwriting, and you're a careful Bible student, you probably think immediately of Genesis and Joseph's encounter with Pharaoh and the reward he received. You may also think of the book of Esther and the reward that was given to Mordecai, who had intervened and reported a threat against the king, that was then thwarted, and nothing had been done to honor Mordecai. And so Haman made recommendations thinking that he would be honored. And in turn, the king said to Haman, "You're exactly right. This is what ought to be done. Get Mordecai and honor him in this way." So rewarding those who do remarkable things is quite ordinary in terms of what we know in Scripture. In relationship to being clothed with purple, if you again have been paying attention, you ought to immediately to think of a woman by the name of Lydia from the city of Thyatira in what is today modern Turkey, and she was a seller of purple. And we don't know if she sold just the dye or sold the dye and the cloth that had been dyed, or just sold purple dyed cloth, but it was extremely expensive. You had to either be royalty or very, very rich to have something like this. A purple garment was just unheard of. It's hard for us, at least for me, it's hard to imagine that, given that you can get just about any color of clothing you want, and I see a whole lot that I wouldn't want. But in biblical times, it was kind of a dirty white at best for nearly everybody. Only people of real substance could have garments that were bright. And this is the king offering to reward the one who can interpret the handwriting with kingly things, like this being clothed in purple and having the gold chain. Joseph got a gold chain from Pharaoh when he interpreted Pharaoh's dream. And he's going to be the third ruler in the kingdom, and that brings us back to what we now know historically. And until 1926, and that used to seem like not all that long ago, but it'll soon be 100 years ago, the so-called scholars said that this was just absolutely made up. It was fiction. There is no record of this king and no reason for a promise that would relegate only a third of the kingdom to the one who could read the handwriting on the wall. But we now know about Nabonidus, and we know about Belshazzar, and we understand that he couldn't offer half the kingdom because Nabonidus would not agree to that. If he offers his half, that is, Belshazzar offers his own personal half, then he's completely out. So the best he could do was a third. It fits perfectly into what we now know to be historically true. So here it is, guys. You're my enchanters, my astrologers, my soothsayers, my Chaldeans. Tell me what this handwriting means, and this is what you'll get. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his lords were perplexed. Why can't they read the writing? Well, let me give you some insights into both Hebrew and Aramaic. Unlike English, which is written from right to left, both those languages were written from, we write from right to left. We write from left to right. They wrote from right to left, just the backwards thing. I had to look up at the slide and realize I said that wrong. They wrote from left to right, backward. That would be confusing enough. But they did not use vowels. That's A-E-I-O and U, by the way. They only used consonants. And they didn't separate words. And they didn't use punctuation. So you've got a series of letters. Where does one word end and another word begin? And what is this word? Can you speak without using vowels? Pretty hard. It would be difficult to look at this and with confidence say, this is what is written, this is what it means, because just slight variances can alter the meaning dramatically. And they look at this. I don't think they had any problem figuring out the letters, But letters have value only when they come together to form words, and they weren't certain about the words. And it doesn't seem appropriate for them to guess. I think they learned their lesson with Nebuchadnezzar, and that lesson has been passed down now from generation to generation. It's better when you don't know an answer to just say, I don't know. Don't try to fake it. And I say that relative to Bible and Bible study. It is always okay to say when asked a question, I don't know, but I'll try to find out. And then go to the Bible. And if you can't find it, find somebody you think can help you. And if they can't find it, find somebody else until you get some kind of answer that is plausible and reasonably faithful to the truth. Well, they're just not even going to venture a guess. Just like they wouldn't tell Nebuchadnezzar what that big tree was all about, they weren't going to even make a guess about the handwriting on the wall. And again, the king's face is pale, and I suspect his legs are weak and his knees may be knocking and his hands may be shaking, because this really has him worked up. And I think honestly you can figure out why, can't you? The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet hall, or the banqueting hall. This we would probably be better off to understand as the queen mother. The queen is already, according to what we've read, present, because the wives of the king as well as his concubines are present. But in a dynasty, the queen mother continues to be held in high respect and has immediate access to the king. Sometimes an easier access than the queen herself. Remember Esther again? When she determined to go before the king without being summoned, she realized that she was putting her own life in jeopardy. But cousin Mordecai says it has to be done, and she says, well, if I perish, I perish. And so she approached the king not being summoned. The queen mother would have an access that even the queen would not have. And so it is almost universally accepted that we're dealing here with the queen mother. And she is older. She still remembers what I think Belshazzar has long ago forgotten, that there is somebody who can deal with things like this. His name is Belteshazzar, but he's generally called in chapter 5 Daniel, and I suspect the reason for that is that this Babylonian name is so close to the king's name that to avoid confusion we refer to Daniel in chapter 5 by his Hebrew, not his Babylonian name. So the queen declared, O king, live forever. A common way of expressing goodwill and hopefully causing the king to lower his defenses. Let not your thoughts alarm you or your color change. Don't get all ruffled and upset and concerned, because there is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And the word gods here in the text is Elohim in Hebrew or Aramaic. It's the same word, just a very slight difference in spelling. And when we encounter Elohim in Scripture, it is almost always translated God rather than gods. I think of Genesis 1:1, Bereshith bara Elohim et hashamayim et haaretz. The word Elohim, though plural, is translated God. In the beginning, God created. And if this queen mother really knows who Daniel is, and Nebuchadnezzar seemed to have come to terms with who he was and who the God of Daniel was, some suspect that she may have even be a believer, have been a believer in the God of Daniel. That's something I can't prove one way or the other. But she says in Daniel is the spirit of the holy gods, or the holy God. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, the enchanters, the Chaldeans and astrologers. You remember this, Belshazzar? Nebuchadnezzar relied on this man. He's still available. The spirit of his God still resides in him, so it's not hopeless. Get some courage. Because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. Seems like a plan to me. Next week, Kurt's going to tell you what Daniel said about the handwriting on the wall, because we are essentially finished for tonight, and I thought the 13th verse would be an excellent place to start next week. And it's pretty